The lights died without warning. 1 second, Madeline Carter was walking through the underground garage of Blackstone Global Tower, heels clicking against concrete, mind still running numbers from the board meeting she'd just survived. The next second, darkness. Total. The kind that presses against your eyes like a hand. Then a voice came out of it. Mrs. Mason Reed. Her whole body went rigid, not because someone was there in the dark with her, but because of the name. That specific name. The one that existed on exactly one document in the world, locked inside a fireproof safe in her home office. A marriage certificate she hadn't looked at in 6 weeks because looking at it hurt too much. Nobody knew that name. Nobody. Her hand moved instinctively to her chest, fingers finding the ring hanging beneath her blouse on a thin gold chain. Cold metal, warm weight, the most expensive secret she'd ever kept. Before we go any further, if stories like this one keep you up at night, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where everything began to unravel. 18 months before that garage went dark, Madeline Carter had been running late. That wasn't unusual. At 29, she was already 12 months into her tenure as CEO of Blackstone Global, a logistics and private security conglomerate with operations in 14 countries, and a board of directors who had never fully accepted that a woman under 40 was sitting in the chair they'd spent decades grooming for someone else. Running late was a survival tactic. The later she arrived to a social function, the less time anyone had to corner her with questions she didn't want to answer. The fundraiser that night was at the Meridian Hotel, a black tie affair for a children's hospital foundation. Madeline had written the check and planned to spend 45 minutes being photographed next to the right people before her driver took her home. She never made it inside. The route from her car to the hotel entrance took her through a side alley the event staff used for deliveries. She'd taken it because the main entrance had camera crews and she was tired of her face being on the news for reasons she couldn't control. What she walked into instead was 3 men, not event staff, not photographers, and the immediate, clarifying understanding that something very bad was about to happen. She'd had self-defense training. Every Blackstone executive above a certain clearance level did. But there were 3 of them, and they weren't hesitating. And the whole thing happened so fast that what she remembered afterward wasn't any specific moment, but a series of fragments, her heels snapping, the brick wall against her back, the sound of her own voice trying to stay controlled while her body understood the situation before her mind caught up. Then Mason Reed came around the corner. He didn't announce himself. He didn't say anything at all, actually, not during the 3.5 minutes it took him to neutralize the situation with the kind of efficiency that didn't look like movie fighting. It looked like someone turning off lights, one after another, calm and methodical and slightly terrifying to watch. When it was over and 2 of the men were unconscious and the third had run, Mason turned to her with a cut above his left eye and said, "Are you hurt?" Not, "Are you okay?" He'd asked specifically if she was hurt, like he already knew she wasn't okay. "My heel broke," she said. It was a ridiculous thing to say. She'd just been assaulted in an alley and she was cataloging footwear damage. But her brain was doing what brains do when they're overwhelmed, reaching for something small and manageable to hold on to. Mason looked down at her shoe, then back at her face. "You're also bleeding. Your left arm." She looked. He was right. "I'm calling the police," she said. "You should." He didn't move to leave. "You want to sit down first? You're shaking." "I'm not." She stopped. She was shaking. Her hands were trembling in a way she couldn't stop by willing them to, which she'd tried twice already. "I don't sit on alley floors." "Fair enough." He pulled off his jacket, a plain dark one, nothing expensive, and offered it to her without fanfare. She took it mostly because her arms were cold and she was shaking, and pride only gets you so far. That was how it started. His name was Mason Reed, and he was 37, and he had a daughter named Sophie, who was 9 years old and who he was raising alone. His wife had died 4 years earlier, cancer, fast and brutal, the kind that doesn't give anyone time to prepare, and he'd spent the years since rebuilding his life from whatever pieces he could gather. He told Madeline these things not all at once, not that first night, but gradually, over the weeks that followed when she found herself calling him. She called him because he'd done a decent thing in an alley, and she wanted to thank him properly. That was what she told herself. She kept calling because he was the only person in her life who didn't want something from her. Every conversation she had, every dinner, every meeting, every text message from a colleague or a board member or someone who claimed to be a friend, there was always a layer underneath it. An agenda. A request disguised as warmth. Madeline had gotten very good at reading it and very tired of doing so. With Mason, it simply wasn't there. He talked to her like she was a person. Not a CEO, not a brand, not an asset. Just a person sitting across from him at a diner table, or on the other end of a phone, or standing in his kitchen while his daughter Sophie showed her a drawing of a horse that was actually quite good for a 9-year-old. Sophie had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, from what Mason described. She was small and serious, and she sized Madeline up at their first meeting with a directness that most adults couldn't manage. "Dad said you got attacked," Sophie said. They were at Mason's kitchen table. He'd stepped out to answer a call. "I did," Madeline said. "Were you scared?" "Yes." Sophie considered this. "Dad gets scared too," she said. "He just doesn't let it show until after." Madeline looked at the doorway where Mason had disappeared. "He told you that?" "No, I figured it out." Sophie went back to her drawing. "Most adults don't tell kids the real stuff, but if you watch, you can usually see it." Madeline thought about that for a long time. She fell in love with him in the way that snuck up on her because she'd been too busy and too guarded to see it coming until it was already there. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a Tuesday in March, sitting on a bench outside Sophie's school waiting for dismissal because Mason's truck had broken down, and she'd offered to pick Sophie up because it was nearby, and she had the time. She was sitting there in a coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, in the middle of a school day with absolutely nothing to do except watch other parents arrive and wait, and she realized she wasn't checking her phone, wasn't running numbers in her head, wasn't bracing for the next thing. She was just sitting there. She told Mason about it that night, described the bench and the other parents and the strange quiet in her own chest. He listened without interrupting, which he always did, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Sophie does that to me too. Forces me to stop." "It wasn't Sophie," Madeline said. "She wasn't there yet." He looked at her. She looked at him. The conversation moved on to other things, but something underneath it had shifted, and neither of them pretended otherwise. He proposed in his kitchen, badly, without a ring, while he was making dinner and she was sitting at the counter going through her email. He said, in the middle of stirring something, without looking up, "I think we should get married." Then he did look up. "I know that's not how you're supposed to say it." Madeline put her phone down. "How are you supposed to say it?" "More setup, better timing." He turned the burner down. "I've been thinking about how to do this properly for 2 months, and I just now ran out of patience." She was quiet for a moment, then, "You've been planning this for 2 months?" "Badly planning it, yeah." She looked at him, this man who'd come around a corner in a dark alley and hadn't said, "Are you okay?" because he was already thinking practically about what she actually needed. Who listened without agenda? Who had a 9-year-old daughter who could read fear on a face and a kitchen that smelled like garlic and something with tomatoes, and absolutely no patience for performing romance correctly. "Okay," she said. He blinked. "Okay, yes, or okay, you'll think about it." "Yes." She picked her phone back up. Obviously, yes. He stood there for a second, then turned back to the stove. "Okay," he said quietly, and she could hear the smile in it. They were married 3 weeks later, small and private. Sophie, in a yellow dress that she'd picked herself because she had opinions about formal wear. No photographers, no press releases, no announcement, just the 4 of them, Madeline, Mason, Sophie, and a courthouse official who had somewhere else to be at 2:30 and made no attempt to hide it. The secrecy had been Madeline's idea, and she'd had reasons that made sense when she laid them out. The Blackstone board was already looking for ammunition to challenge her leadership. A sudden marriage to a man nobody knew, a former military figure with a classified service record. The optics could be weaponized. She needed 6 months, she told herself, just long enough to consolidate her position, to make herself indispensable, to make them need her more than they resented her. Then she'd announce. Then they could be normal. 6 months became 8. 8 became 12. 12 became 18. The ring moved from her finger to a chain around her neck, tucked under blouses and blazers. She told herself this was temporary. She told Mason the same thing, and to his credit, or maybe to the detriment of what they were quietly building, he didn't argue. He understood institutional politics the way soldiers understand certain kinds of terrain. You don't fight it head on, you navigate it, and you wait for better ground. What Madeline hadn't fully accounted for was what 18 months of invisibility would do to a man who'd already spent years becoming someone the world overlooked. The janitor job had been Mason's idea, and when he first suggested it, Madeline had stared at him like he'd proposed something genuinely crazy. "You want to work in my building," she'd said, "as maintenance staff. I want to be close in case something goes sideways." He'd said it simply, like it was logical, because to him it was. "Someone's been watching the house. I haven't made enough of it to alarm you, but I'm not ignoring it either. You've been surveilled and you didn't tell me? I wasn't sure. Now I'm more sure." She'd looked at him across the kitchen table, her husband, the man she'd married in a courthouse, with a courthouse official who had somewhere to be, and she'd understood that the conversation about the surveillance was the real one, but it was going to have to wait because there was a more immediate problem. "If you work at Blackstone," she said carefully, "we have to be even more careful. If anyone connects us, I know. Mason, I mean, we'd have to act like strangers." He'd nodded, and something in his face had done something she couldn't quite read before it settled back into neutral. "I know what I'm signing up for." She believed him. She hadn't fully understood what she was asking him to accept. So Mason Reed applied for a facilities position at Blackstone Global and was hired without ceremony because janitorial staff didn't require the same background scrutiny as security or executive assistants, and whatever was buried in his classified file didn't surface in the standard check. He worked the night shift, executive floors, which meant he was cleaning glass offices and emptying wastebaskets while senior vice presidents ate late dinners at their desks and talked about other people's incompetence. They talked in front of him the way people talk in front of furniture. Madeline passed him in hallways sometimes. She'd learned early to trust herself to be professional about it because she'd practiced, standing in front of her bathroom mirror, telling herself he's a member of the facilities team until she could do it with a neutral expression. She'd pass him in a corridor and nod the way she nodded at any employee and keep walking, and she'd get around the corner and stand very still for a second with her eyes closed. She told herself they were protecting Sophie. That was true. There were people from Mason's past, from operations she only knew in rough outline because his file had been classified at levels she didn't have clearance for, who would use leverage wherever they could find it. A daughter. A wife. The CEO of a company with government contracts. She was a target if anyone connected them. She told herself the arrangement was temporary. That was also true. She just kept failing to determine what it was temporary until... Mason noticed things on the executive floors that nobody asked him about and that he couldn't have reported without explaining how he knew what he was looking at. Adrian Vaughn, the chief operating officer, had a habit of taking calls in the stairwell that he thought was private. The stairwells had bad acoustics. Mason had spent years operating in environments where you learn to extract information from bad acoustics, and what he pulled from those fragments over 3 weeks was incomplete but pointed somewhere he didn't like. He didn't tell Madeline right away. He needed more. He also noticed she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with her hours, which were brutal, and everything to do with something she was carrying that she wasn't putting down. He recognized it because he'd looked the same way during the worst deployments, that particular flatness around the eyes that comes from maintaining a performance for too long. He wanted to say something about it. In the 2-minute windows when they were genuinely alone, the elevator she took at 7 a.m. that he happened to be near, the parking level where their paths crossed on Thursdays, he thought about how to say it. He never quite found the words that didn't sound like complaint, and complaint wasn't what he meant. He meant, I see you working yourself hollow, and I want to be the person you come home to actually, not the person you pass in a hallway and look through. But that was a longer conversation, and there was never time for longer conversations. and he kept telling himself they'd have it soon. The photographs arrived on a Wednesday. 3 of them slipped into the supply closet where he kept his cleaning cart. Print photographs, which meant someone had gone to the trouble of printing them, which was a specific kind of message. One was Sophie walking out of school. One was Madeline in the underground garage, taken from a position he calculated had to be a specific corner where the camera blind spot was. The third was Mason himself, in the building, in his uniform, pushing the cart. No note, no demand, just the photos. He stood in that supply closet for approximately 30 seconds, very still, doing the kind of thinking he'd learned to do fast because slow thinking got people killed. Then he put the photographs in his jacket and finished his shift. He was going to need more than 2 minutes in an elevator. He sent her a message that night. Their system, a channel she'd set up that ran through a proxy, nothing traceable to either of them directly, that said only, "We need to talk, real talk, soon." She read it and replied, "Board meeting Thursday." "Friday?" "Friday," he typed back. Friday never came. The company's annual gala was 2 days away, and somewhere in the city, in an office or a warehouse or a room Madeline didn't know existed, a man named Damian Cross was finishing a plan he'd been building for 14 months, waiting for exactly the right moment. He'd found his moment, and Mason's photographs had been his opening move. The gala was Blackstone Global's largest annual event, and Madeline had spent 3 weeks not wanting to attend it. That wasn't a position she could afford to hold. The gala was board theater, the kind of evening where deals got made over cocktails and grievances got aired through toasts, and everything that happened in the room mattered twice as much as anything that happened in an actual meeting. Her presence wasn't optional. Her performance wasn't optional. She would wear the right dress and say the right things and shake the right hands and give a speech that was confident without being aggressive and inclusive without being weak, walking the particular tightrope that female executives learned to walk or fell off of. She'd written the speech herself, 14 drafts. What she hadn't written and couldn't have was the part of the evening that nobody planned for. The Meridian Grand Ballroom held 400 people when it was set for dinner, and tonight it was exactly that full. Blackstone's senior leadership occupied the front tables. Board members circulated with the particular ease of people who knew the room belonged to them, regardless of whose name was on the invitation. Journalists and analysts filled the middle section, watching everything with the professional detachment of people paid to turn what they observed into a story that fit whatever narrative their publication needed that week. Mason was not in the ballroom. He was on the service level 2 floors below, in a corridor that connected the hotel's kitchen facilities to the loading dock, pushing a cart that didn't belong to the Meridian, but that nobody had questioned because he was wearing a uniform and moving with the unhurried purpose of someone who had a job to do and was doing it. He'd arranged the shift weeks earlier through a facilities contractor that Blackstone used for event staffing. He'd done it quietly, without asking permission, without telling Madeline, because telling Madeline would have required explaining the photographs, and he hadn't found the right moment, and he was running out of time to find one. The photographs were in his jacket pocket. He'd been carrying them for 2 days. He worked the service level and kept his ears open and watched who came and went through the staff entrances, because if Damian Cross had sent those photographs, then Cross had someone inside the building. And the inside of a building this size had a lot of places to stand without being noticed. It took him 40 minutes to find what he was looking for. The man's name was, as far as Mason could determine, nobody he recognized directly. But the way he stood near the security station at the east entrance, positioned to watch without appearing to watch, weight slightly forward, one hand consistently near his right hip, was a posture Mason had seen in enough operational environments to read without thinking about it. Civilian clothes that fit like they'd been selected to conceal something. Earpiece. Not hotel staff. Not Blackstone security, whose personnel Mason had memorized from the building's directory. Someone else's asset. Mason pulled out his phone and sent Madeline a message. "Don't use the East Corridor tonight. Any reason, any excuse. Stay in the main rooms." He didn't explain why. There wasn't space to explain why, and he needed her to just do it. Her reply came 8 minutes later, between what he estimated were conversations. Noted. One word. That was Madeline operating in a room full of people who couldn't know she was receiving messages from her husband, who they didn't know existed, about a threat she didn't have the full picture of yet. He'd always admired the economy of how she communicated under pressure. It was one of the first things he'd noticed about her. Not the polish, which was visible to anyone, but the precision underneath it. Upstairs, Madeline was having the kind of evening she'd trained herself to endure. The board member she least trusted, a 71-year-old named Gerald Fitch, who had survived 6 regime changes at Blackstone by being useful to whoever held power, and who she suspected was already shopping her replacement before she'd given him any concrete reason to, had cornered her near the bar during the pre-dinner reception. He had the particular talent of making an ambush feel like a coincidence. Madeline. He touched her elbow briefly, the way older men in suits touched women's elbows when they wanted to establish proximity without being obvious about it. "You look well." "Gerald." She smiled exactly as much as the moment required. "I was just heading to—" "Only a minute." He didn't move. "I wanted to ask about the Harrington contract. Rumor has it we're losing it." "Rumor is occasionally accurate," she said. "In this case, it's also incomplete. We're renegotiating the terms, not losing the contract. There's a difference." "Of course." His expression didn't change, but his eyes did something behind it. "And the restructuring of the Eastern Division is on schedule and within budget." She kept her voice warm. The warmth cost her something. "Gerald, I know you worry. It's one of your better qualities. But if you'd like a full briefing, my assistant can schedule something this week." He smiled. "That would be wonderful." She extracted herself and crossed the room to where her VP of Communications was waiting with the expression of someone who'd watched the exchange from 20 feet away and needed to debrief it. His name was Patrick Cole. He was 44, and he was one of approximately 3 people at Blackstone she actually trusted, which was a number she'd learned to accept as normal. "Fitch is fishing," Patrick said quietly, handing her a glass of water she hadn't asked for but needed. "Fitch is always fishing." She took the water. "What's he actually after?" "My guess? He wants the quarterly numbers before the official release, and he's hoping you'll give him something he can take to the other board members as evidence that you're collaborative." Collaborative meaning controllable. "That's generally what they mean by it, yes." Madeline drank her water and looked out across the ballroom. The 400 people, the right dresses and right suits, the conversations happening in layers, surface, and subtext running simultaneously in every exchange. She did a quick mental scan of where the board members were positioned, which analysts were talking to which executives, whether Adrian Vaughn had arrived yet. He had. He was near the far end of the room, talking to a woman she didn't recognize. Not a Blackstone employee, not press, not a board member's spouse. Someone he'd brought or someone he'd arranged to meet here. He was laughing at something she'd said, easy and relaxed, and Madeline watched him for a moment with the particular attention she'd developed for Adrian over the past few months. Adrian Vaughn was 46 and had been COO of Blackstone for 3 years before Madeline arrived. He'd expected to be her, essentially. When the board had been deciding on a new CEO, his name had been on the short list, and it hadn't been selected, and he had handled that in the way that some men handle professional disappointment, which was to keep performing loyalty while quietly building an alternative. He was good at his job. That made him more dangerous, not less. She looked away before he could catch her watching. Her phone buzzed with Mason's message about the East Corridor. She read it once, committed it, replied without changing her expression. She didn't ask him why. If Mason said don't use the East Corridor, there was a reason, and getting the reason would require a conversation she couldn't have in this room. And in the meantime, the sensible thing was simply to not use the East Corridor. That was the particular grammar of being married to him, trusting that the sentence made sense even when you hadn't heard all of it yet. The dinner went the way dinners like this go. Courses arriving at intervals timed to keep people at their tables long enough to be captive audience for the speeches. Wine poured with the particular attentiveness of staff who understood their tip depended on it. Madeline gave her speech between the salad and the main course, which was the strategic slot, because people were settled but not yet restless, and she'd written it for exactly this room and this mood. She talked about growth without using the word growth, which executives overuse to the point of meaninglessness. She talked about institutional integrity and what it meant to build a company that people could trust rather than a company people were contractually obligated to deal with. She made a joke about the Eastern Division restructuring that landed well enough that even Fitch smiled, though his smile was the kind that didn't fully reach his face. She did not talk about herself. She'd learned early that the room wanted competence from her, not personality. When she sat back down, Patrick leaned over and said quietly, "Good. That was actually good. Was it not supposed to be? I just worry when you're under this much pressure that the edges come through." He said it gently. They didn't tonight. She thought about Mason's message sitting in her phone. "I'm fine," she said. Patrick gave her the look he gave her when she said, "I'm fine," which was a specific look that communicated he didn't believe her but also wasn't going to push it, and went back to his dinner. The problem with Adrian Vaughn was not that he was ambitious. The problem was that he was organized. Mason had figured this out through 6 weeks of listening in stairwells, and what he'd assembled from those fragments was incomplete, in the way that intelligence gathered without full resources is always incomplete, but the shape of it was visible enough. Vaughn had a channel to someone outside Blackstone, not unusual for a COO of his level who managed external partnerships, but the conversations weren't about partnerships. They were about timing, about when something would happen rather than what it would be, about making sure she was in position. She, not referred to by name, ever, in the fragments Mason had caught, just she. He'd spent 2 weeks trying to determine whether she meant Madeline or someone else entirely, and he hadn't been able to rule it out either way, and the photographs had arrived before he could get enough to be certain. Now he was standing in a service corridor watching a man he didn't know the name of talking on a phone near the east entrance, and the call had been going on for 11 minutes, which was too long for a check-in and too short for a negotiation, which meant it was probably coordination. Mason moved closer, cart in front of him, head down, and he caught enough. After the speech, East Corridor, "The car is ready." He was moving before the call finished. Madeline's security detail for the evening was 2 people from Blackstone's contracted security firm, standard protocol for an event of this size. She knew both of them by sight. What she didn't know, because it had been changed in the system that afternoon by someone with access she shouldn't have known about, was that one of them had been replaced. The man standing 10 feet from her table with the Blackstone security badge was not the same man whose photograph was in the file. She had no way to know that. She had no reason to look twice. When the dinner ended and the room shifted into the post-dinner portion of the evening, dessert and mingling and the slow exodus of people who had other places to be, one of her security detail came to her elbow and suggested, quietly and professionally, that they should move to the private reception area through the East Corridor, where several board members wanted a separate conversation. Madeline thought about Mason's message. "The East Corridor," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Shorter route." She paused. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Long enough to think about it, but not so long that it read as hesitation. "Tell them I'll be there in 15 minutes, she said. "I need to speak with someone first." She turned back toward the main room, moving toward Patrick, and that was the moment 2 things happened almost simultaneously. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mason that said only, "Don't go," in capitals he never used, and the hand came down on her arm, firm and practiced, and the man who was not the man from the file said, very quietly, "This way, Ms. Carter. There's been a change of plans." She registered all of this in about 1 second. Then she did something that surprised him, she thought, because he hadn't expected her to be the kind of person who did it. She screamed. Not a panicked scream. A loud, sharp, deliberate scream designed to carry through a crowded ballroom and make 400 people turn around. He was faster than she'd calculated. The corridor door was closer than she'd realized. The ballroom door closed behind them, and the noise cut off, and they were in the East Corridor, which was service-lit and empty, and longer than it looked on the event floor map. And there were 2 more men waiting. She stopped fighting the grip on her arm. Not because she'd given up, but because fighting a grip with 3 men in a corridor was a losing calculation, and she needed to think. "Where are we going?" she said. Flat. Not a question. The man didn't answer. She filed that away. People who don't answer questions are usually following instructions not to, which means there are instructions, which means there is a structure, which means there is a plan that exists on paper somewhere. Plans have seams. She looked for the seams and kept walking. Mason heard the scream. He was 40 feet from the ballroom door when it happened, moving fast but trying not to run because running in a service corridor draws attention, and he was still technically a maintenance worker. The scream cut through the ambient noise of 400 people at dessert, brief and sharp, and then gone. And he felt it in his chest in the particular way you feel things that involve someone you love. He ran. The east corridor door was closing when he reached it. He caught a glimpse. Madeline, 3 men, moving away from him. And then the door closed, and he hit it at speed, and it was locked from the other side. He stood there for approximately 1 second. Then he went for the parallel service route. The thing about the Meridian Grand was that it was a 30-year-old building with a renovation history, which meant it had 3 different generations of floor plans layered on top of each other, and the service infrastructure didn't always match the public-facing corridors. Mason had studied those floor plans before tonight. He'd pulled the building schematics through the same contractor access that had gotten him on the staffing roster, and he'd spent an afternoon learning the building the way he'd learned 100 other buildings in his career, not memorizing rooms, but understanding how the space is connected, where the redundant routes were, which doors would be open at which times during an event like this. He knew a route that would put him ahead of them. He moved through it without hesitation. Service stairway, half-level, utility corridor, the loading bay access that led out near the underground garage entrance. It took him 3 minutes and 40 seconds, and he was breathing harder than he would have been 5 years ago, which was a thing he noticed and filed away for later. He came out of the utility door and into the garage level, and he was 15 feet ahead of them. There was a black SUV idling near the east elevator bank. Driver behind the wheel, engine running. Mason saw it and did the math in 2 seconds. This was the car, the one the voice on the phone had mentioned, the one they were walking Madeline toward right now. And he moved to the driver's side and knocked on the window. The driver, startled, looked at him. Mason looked back, and his expression communicated something that wasn't aggression exactly, but that made the driver do a rapid reassessment of how the next 30 seconds would go. "Keys?" Mason said through the glass. The driver made a different choice, reached for something under the dash instead, and that was when Mason stopped asking. He wasn't going to describe afterward what happened next, not in detail. He'd spent years learning how to neutralize a threat with the minimum necessary force, and he was still good at it, and the driver was no longer a problem, and Mason had the keys, and he was back on the garage-level concrete when the corridor door opened and the 3 men walked Madeline out into the overhead fluorescent light. She saw him. He saw her see him. Her expression did something complicated, relief and fear and something else he didn't have a word for. And then the man holding her arm did something that was probably automatic, because it was what you did when something unexpected appeared in front of you. He stopped. That was the opening. Mason had fought enough people to know that a fight in a parking garage with 3 trained men was not a situation he would get through clean, and he didn't. He got through it effective, which was a different thing. He took a hit in the ribs from the second man that was going to be a problem in the morning, and there was a moment with the third man where the outcome was genuinely unclear, and through all of it he was tracking Madeline, who had done something smart the moment the grip on her arm loosened. She'd moved toward the SUV and put it between herself and the situation, which put a few tons of steel on her side of the equation. When it was over, the 3 men were not in a condition to drive anyone anywhere, and Mason was leaning against the garage wall doing a check of his own damage, and Madeline walked around the front of the SUV and looked at him. He looked back. "You're bleeding," she said. Same words as the first time, in the alley, 18 months ago. "So are you," he said. She was. A cut on her cheek, not deep, from when the first man had pushed her into the corridor door in the ballroom. She hadn't mentioned it. They stood there in the fluorescent light of a parking garage with 3 unconscious men on the concrete and the SUV still idling, and somewhere above them 400 people who didn't know any of this had happened, and Madeline said, "The photographs." "Yeah. You knew before tonight." "I knew something. Not all of it." She was quiet for a moment. Not angry yet. That would come later, when the adrenaline settled and she had the luxury of feeling the things she'd been holding back. Right now she was still running on the clarity that crisis produces. The strange, narrowed focus where everything unnecessary falls away and you see the actual shape of things. "Who?" she said. "I don't know yet." He pushed off the wall. His ribs said something unpleasant about that. But whoever it is, they know about us. They use the East Corridor specifically. Someone told them you'd be moved that way. She looked at him. He watched her work through what that meant. The inside knowledge, the redirected security detail, the timing. Adrian? She said. Not a question exactly. More like something clicking into place. I don't have enough yet to be sure. I do. She said it with the flatness of someone who's been watching a thing build for months and has just seen the confirmation they'd been dreading. I've been watching him for weeks. I couldn't prove it, and I couldn't act on a feeling. Now you have more than a feeling. Now I have men on the floor of a parking garage. She looked at the three of them. We need to call the police. We do, he agreed. And then there's something else. She looked at him. This isn't finished, he said. Whoever organized this, these three weren't the point. They were a mechanism. Someone sent them, and that someone is still out there. And they know enough about us that I need you to start taking seriously that Sophie's situation needs to change. He said Sophie's name and watched something shift in Madeline's face, the last remaining layer of operational detachment falling away, because Sophie was the word that always got through every defense either of them had built. Where is she? Madeline asked. With Helen. Helen was Mason's neighbor, 63, retired school administrator, under the impression that Mason worked a security consulting job and occasionally needed last-minute childcare, which wasn't entirely false. She's fine. Helen's got no idea anything's wrong. Does she need to? Not tonight. Tonight she's fine. He looked at Madeline steadily. But we're not handling this the same way going forward. I need you to understand that. She held his look. There was a whole other conversation inside the one they were having, about the 18 months, about the ring on the chain, about the East Corridor she almost walked into without him, about, I need you to understand that being Mason's way of telling her, without saying it in a way that sounded like an ultimatum, that he was done letting the situation be what it had been. I know, she said quietly. It wasn't enough to fix anything, but it was honest, and between them honest had always been the currency that mattered. He nodded once. Then he took out his phone and called the police, and while he was on the call, Madeline straightened her dress and touched the cut on her cheek and looked up at the concrete ceiling of the garage with an expression that was not calm but was controlled, and she started building the story in her head, what she'd say, what she'd explain, what she'd hold back until she understood more. The couple stood 5 feet apart in the fluorescent light, not touching, because old habits are hard to break even when a parking garage full of evidence has just made the secrecy feel very stupid. But Mason reached out as he finished the call and touched the back of her hand briefly, just for a second. She turned her palm up and held his fingers. Then she let go, because the first police siren was already winding through the garage levels below, and the next chapter of the night was about to start, and neither of them could afford to be anything other than what the public record said they were. He a janitor. She a CEO. Two strangers who happened to be in the wrong place. Us. What the police report captured was accurate as far as it went. An attempted abduction of a corporate executive during a private event. 3 assailants, incapacitated by a Blackstone Facilities employee who had responded to a disturbance. The CEO had not been harmed. The perpetrators were in custody. What the report didn't capture was the way Detective Rowan Salas, who took the initial statement, looked between Madeline and Mason with the particular expression of someone who processed information for a living and had just processed something that didn't quite fit the story he'd been given. He'd asked Madeline at one point how the facilities employee had known to be in that specific area of the garage. I don't know, Madeline said. I'm grateful he was. Salas had written something down. Then he'd looked at Mason. Mr. Reed, you work the executive floors. Yes? But tonight you were on the service level. Event staffing, it's a different assignment when the building hosts a large event. Right. Salas wrote something else. And you knew to come to the garage specifically because I heard a disturbance. Salas looked at him for a moment with an expression that communicated he was noting the answer without accepting it. I'll need to follow up, he said, to no one in particular. He would. Mason knew he would. And when he did, the particular architecture of what Mason and Madeline were to each other would either hold together or it wouldn't, and the consequences of it not holding together were now pointing in a direction that was sharper and more specific than awkward board meeting. Adrian Vaughn had already left the gala by the time the police arrived. His absence would not go unnoticed, but absence wasn't evidence. And the particular thing about a man like Adrian was that he was organized. He wouldn't have left a clean line between himself and tonight. Upstairs, Patrick Cole was managing the fallout in the ballroom, redirecting journalists, briefing Blackstone's PR firm, doing the particular kind of damage control that he was good at, and that Madeline was grateful for in ways she should probably say out loud more often. He'd texted her twice during her statement. She'd replied both times with single words. Sophie was asleep at Helen's house. She didn't know anything had happened. Mason stood outside the garage in the night air while two uniformed officers processed the scene, and he looked at the photographs in his jacket pocket one more time. 3 of them. Sophie, Madeline, himself. Someone had sent them to tell him they knew. They'd wanted him afraid or reactive or both. He wasn't afraid. He was something more focused than that, and colder. And he recognized the feeling from operational contexts he hadn't occupied in years. The particular state of having a defined threat and a defined priority and no remaining patience for anything that wasn't relevant to protecting both. The defined priority was Sophie and Madeline. And the truth, which was that the arrangement that had seemed manageable had just become something else entirely. Damian Cross's name hadn't surfaced yet. It would, but not tonight. Tonight there were statements to give and wounds to have looked at and a daughter to check on before morning, and Mason Reed stood in the night air outside the Meridian Grand Hotel and breathed in and breathed out and waited for whatever came next. Detective Rowan Salas called Mason at 7:43 the following morning. Mason was already awake. He'd been awake since 4, sitting at the kitchen table in the house he and Madeline technically shared, but that had felt more like a relay station than a home for the better part of a year. One of them always arriving as the other was leaving, the rhythms of two people's lives running parallel without quite intersecting. Sophie was still at Helen's. Madeline had come home at 2 in the morning after the police and the PR management and the board calls that couldn't wait, and she'd sat down on the couch and been asleep inside 4 minutes, still in the dress, and Mason had put a blanket over her and gone to the kitchen and started thinking. He was still thinking when the phone rang. "Mr. Reed." Salas had the voice of someone who'd also been up since 4. "I have some follow-up questions. I figured you might. The 3 men from last night, 2 of them aren't talking, which is their right. The third one is cooperating, which is interesting." A pause. "The name Damian Cross mean anything to you?" Mason was quiet for 3 seconds. "Mr. Reed." "I heard you." He looked at the window. The early light was doing what early light does in autumn, coming in flat and gray and without warmth. Where did that name come from? "The cooperative gentleman mentioned it. Said he was hired through a contractor who worked for Cross. Said he didn't know what the job was specifically, just that it involved acquiring a corporate executive and holding her until contact was made." Another pause, shorter. "The way you just went quiet when I said that name tells me you know who that is." "It's a classified matter," Mason said. "Former military. Former Navy." "Right." Salas was writing something. Mason could hear the pen. "You want to tell me what a classified Navy matter has to do with the CEO of Blackstone Global being grabbed out of her own company's event?" "Not over the phone." "Can you come in this morning?" "Give me 2 hours." He ended the call and sat with the name for a moment. Damian Cross. He'd known it was possible. The photographs had suggested it. The methodology of last night had suggested it. The specific targeting of Madeline rather than a random leverage opportunity had suggested it. But knowing something is possible and hearing the name spoken out loud are 2 different experiences. Cross had been the operational commander of an international network that ran kidnapping for ransom operations across 4 continents. They'd been sophisticated, patient, selective. They targeted family members of corporate figures and government officials, and anyone else with enough money and enough reason to keep quiet. Mason had spent 8 months working the intelligence side of a joint operation to dismantle them, and at the end of it, the network was structurally destroyed. Most of the leadership was dead or in custody. Most. Cross had been in the building when it came down. Literally, the warehouse in which the final operation had concluded, which had involved a controlled structural failure that Mason had planned and executed, and the after-action report had listed him as killed in the collapse. Bodies were not always recovered. Mason had noted that at the time. He had filed an objection to the killed in action designation, and the objection had been reviewed and overruled, and eventually he'd had to accept that the paperwork said what it said. Damian Cross was dead. Except Damian Cross had just tried to take his wife. He woke Madeline at 7. She came awake fast, the way she always did, sitting up with her eyes already focused before she'd fully processed where she was. She looked at him, and looked at the blanket on her lap, and looked at the window. "What time is it?" she said. 7. He handed her coffee. "We need to talk before you have to deal with whatever this morning is going to bring." She took the coffee and looked at him over it. The cut on her cheek had been cleaned and closed with 2 butterfly strips at the hospital, and it looked worse this morning than it had last night, the bruising coming up around it. He'd taken a hit in the ribs that made breathing at certain angles unpleasant. They were both operational, which was the bar he was measuring against. "Damian Cross," he said. She waited. He told her. Not everything. There were things in his service record that existed behind classification levels that he wasn't going to breach even in his own kitchen. And there were things about the operation that she didn't need and that putting in her head would only add weight she didn't have room to carry right now. But the essential shape of it, the network, the operation, the after-action designation, the fact that Cross was apparently not as dead as the paperwork suggested. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he valued most about her in moments like this. The ability to hold still and take information in before responding to it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known he might be alive?" she said. "Not is he dangerous, or what does he want? How long had Mason known?" "I didn't know," he said. "I had a possibility." When the photographs arrived, Cross's methodology was one of several things that fit. "I started treating it as the most likely option 2 days ago." 2 days? Yeah. She looked at her coffee. "I understand why you didn't—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not frustrated that you had 2 days of a possibility, and I didn't know about it. Fair. But I also know that I spent 18 months not giving you the conversation we needed to have, so—" She exhaled through her nose. "We're both carrying things we shouldn't have been carrying alone." It was the most direct she'd been about the 18 months since the night she'd agreed to marry him, and he received it as what it was, which wasn't an apology exactly, but was an acknowledgement, which from Madeline sometimes counted for more. "Salis wants me to come in this morning," he said. Cross's name came up in the interrogation of one of the 3 from last night. "Which means the police now have a thread that leads somewhere classified." "Yes." She set the coffee down. "You need to make some calls before you go in. Someone in your former chain of command who can either confirm or deny, and who can establish what level of information you're permitted to share with local law enforcement." "That's what I was thinking." "And while you're doing that," she said, standing, "I need to call Patrick and figure out what the board situation looks like this morning. Because by now, every board member has heard about last night, and at least 2 of them are going to use it as leverage, and I need to get ahead of that before Fitch convenes an informal conversation without me." She was already moving toward the hallway, already in the part of her brain that processed problems sequentially and started on the first one. And he watched her and thought that this was the thing nobody saw who watched her on camera, or read her press coverage, or sat across from her in board meetings. The specific quality of how she functioned under pressure, which wasn't the performance of competence, but the actual thing, messy and efficient, and occasionally bruised. "Madeline," he said. She stopped in the doorway. "Sophie needs to know something happened. Not the details. But she's going to pick up that something's wrong, and she needs to hear it from us before she figures it out on her own." A brief silence. "I know." "She's going to be angry that we didn't tell her sooner." "I know that too." She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe. "She's going to be angry at me specifically because she already thinks I'm not straightforward with her. She doesn't think that. She's 10. She reads people better than most adults I employ." She pushed off the doorframe. "I'll talk to her this afternoon when she's back from Helen's." He nodded. She went to make the calls she needed to make, and he went to make his. The man Mason reached at 8:15 had a job title that didn't accurately describe what he did, and a phone number that didn't appear in any directory. And when Mason said the name Damian Cross, there was a silence on the line that went slightly longer than the kind that means you're thinking. "Where did you get that name?" the man said. "Local police. One of Cross's contractors was picked up last night." Another silence. "You've been in contact with law enforcement." "My wife was almost kidnapped, so yes." The man processed this. His name was Garrett, first name only in Mason's experience, and he had been the intelligence coordinator for the operation that had officially ended Damian Cross's network. He was not a field person. He was the kind of person who stayed behind the glass and managed information. And when he was surprised, he went very still and quiet instead of reactive, which was happening right now. "Cross is listed KIA, Garrett said finally. "I know what he's listed as." "Mason, Garrett!" He kept his voice level. "I need to know two things. First, whether there is any internal information suggesting the KIA designation was inaccurate. Second, what I'm permitted to share with local law enforcement when I sit down with them this morning." A longer pause this time. Mason heard a door close in whatever office Garrett was calling from. "Give me 4 hours, Garrett said. "I have 2. 3. "Fine." He hung up and sat with the silence of the kitchen for a moment. Through the wall he could hear Madeline on her phone, her voice carrying the particular cadence it had when she was managing a conversation that required patience she didn't have, steady and controlled, with a rhythm that was slightly more deliberate than her natural pace. He thought about Cross, about the after-action report, about the body they hadn't recovered, and the designation that had been pushed through over his objection by people who needed the operation to be finished because the resources were needed elsewhere. About the 14 months since the gala photographs had suggested someone was watching, which was also approximately how long it would take a man who'd survived a controlled structural failure to rebuild enough of a network to mount an operation like last night. 14 months. The timing fit. He opened his laptop and started pulling everything he could find from public sources about Cross, because the classified material wasn't something he could access on a home network, and because sometimes you found things in public sources that the classified record missed because the classified record only tracked what agencies were looking at, and agencies had institutional blind spots the same as anyone else. Madeline's morning was a cascade. Patrick had been managing the board situation since 6 a.m. and had sent her a summary that read, in his characteristic understated way, "It's busy. Call me before you talk to anyone else." She'd called him first, from the bedroom while Mason made his calls from the kitchen, and the summary he gave her verbally was less understated. "Fitch wants an emergency board meeting," Patrick said. "He's framing it as a security review, but the actual agenda, the one I'm inferring from the 3 calls he made before 7 this morning, is a competency discussion. He's going to use a kidnapping attempt to question my leadership. He's going to use a kidnapping attempt to ask whether the CEO's personal situation creates security vulnerabilities for the company." She understood immediately what that meant. "He doesn't know about Mason." "Not yet, but Salas's report goes into the corporate security file, which the board has access to, and the report names a Blackstone Facilities employee as the responding party, and someone is going to ask questions about why that specific person was in that specific place." Patrick paused. "It might be Fitch. It might be someone Fitch sends." She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. The ring was still on the chain around her neck. She'd slept in it, which she often did, the weight of it familiar enough that she stopped noticing. "What's the timeline on the board meeting request?" "He wants it today. I pushed back to tomorrow morning, which is the earliest I could justify. That gives you 1 day," she calculated. 1 day to figure out how to get ahead of this before Fitch turns a security incident into a governance crisis. "That's roughly where I am, yes. What about Adrian? Has he surfaced?" "He sent an email at 6 a.m. saying he'd heard about the incident and was relieved you were unharmed and that he was available for whatever the company needed. Very warm, very prompt." "Too prompt." "I thought so." She stood up and went to the window. The street below was doing its ordinary morning things. A delivery truck, a woman walking a dog, The particular mundane choreography of a neighborhood that didn't know anything unusual had happened nearby. Patrick, what do you actually know about Adrian's external contacts? Not the official partnership portfolio, the side conversations. A short pause. I know you've been watching him. What do you know? I know he had 3 meetings in the last 6 weeks that weren't on the official calendar. I know one of them was at a location that wasn't a restaurant or an office. It was a parking facility near the waterfront, which is an unusual place for a COO to have a business lunch. He said it carefully, in the way he said things when he'd been sitting on information and wasn't sure if he should have. I didn't bring it up because I wasn't sure what I was looking at. You're sure now? I'm more sure, he said. Keep it between us until I tell you otherwise. Don't let it get into anything written. Already haven't. After she hung up, she stood at the window for another minute. Then she unclasped the chain from around her neck and held the ring in her palm, looking at it. Small and plain. Mason had offered to replace it with something more substantial, and she'd told him she didn't want a different ring, which was true, but she hadn't told him the full reason, which was that the simplicity of it was the part that felt real to her. The expensive things in her life were investments or symbols or performance. This was just a ring that a man had put on her finger in a courthouse while his daughter watched in a yellow dress. She closed her fingers around it and went to get dressed. The meeting with Sally's ran 90 minutes, during which Garrett called back 40 minutes in and Mason stepped out to take the call. What Garrett told him, in the compressed language of someone delivering information that had implications he was still processing, was this. The KIA designation for Damian Cross had been flagged internally 6 months after the operation. A signal's intercept had suggested the possibility of survival. The flag had not been acted upon because the intercept was rated low confidence and the operation was officially closed, and the resources to reopen a closed case were not available. The flag sat in a file. Nobody had connected it to Mason, who was by that point no longer active duty, because nobody had thought to look at whether Cross might target former operatives. There's going to be an internal review, Garrett said. Good, Mason said. Mason, the review is going to involve questions about your current situation, your employment, the civilian life you've built. Some of that may surface in ways you're not going to be able to control. I'm aware. The CEO of Blackstone. I know who she is, Garrett. A pause. Right. And something in Garrett's voice shifted slightly, the professional distance adjusting as he recalculated. How long? 18 months. Another pause. Longer. Does she know what you did? Specifically what you did in the operation? She knows the shape of it, but not the specifics. No. When this review opens up, the specifics are going to come out. Some of them. The parts that explain why Cross would come after her to get to you. Mason was quiet for a moment. Outside the police station, a bus went by. A woman was arguing with someone on her phone. Ordinary Tuesday. I'll handle that conversation, he said. You should have it soon. I know. He went back inside and finished the meeting with Sally's, and the information sharing was calibrated, enough to give law enforcement a usable picture of who Cross was and why he'd staged last night's operation, not enough to breach the classification levels that Garrett had given him parameters around. Salas listened and wrote and asked sharp questions, and at the end of it leaned back in his chair and looked at Mason with the expression of someone assembling a picture that was getting more complicated the more pieces he added. So this Cross, Salas said, he's not after the company, he's after you. He's after leverage. She's the leverage. Because you were the one who took down his network. That's right. And she didn't know any of this when she married you. Mason looked at him. She knew I was former Navy. She knew there were classified elements of my service record. She didn't know the specifics of Cross or that specific operation. He paused. She knows now. Salas wrote something. If Cross is alive and operational, last night wasn't the end of it. It was a test. I know. He wanted to see how you'd respond, whether you'd surface. And I surfaced, which tells him what he wanted to know. Salas set the pen down. He's going to come back with more resources and a different approach now that he knows you're operational. That's how he thinks, yes. So what do you need from us? Mason considered the question. Sophie needs a protective detail that doesn't look like a protective detail. She's 10 and she's perceptive. And if it looks like security, she'll understand what it means. And I'd rather she not have to understand that yet. Salas nodded slowly. And your wife? Madeline has her own corporate security. I need to know whether those files are clean, whether Cross's inside source contaminated the security personnel roster or just the event staffing last night. We pulled the credentials of the man who replaced your regular detail. He had clean paperwork, excellent quality, not the kind of forgery you get from a standard contractor. Cross used to run a network that specialized in this. His documentation people were some of the best. Which means the contamination could be deeper than one event staffer. Which means Madeline's security needs to be rebuilt from scratch with people I can personally verify. Salas looked at him for a long moment. You're going to run this yourself. I'm going to contribute to it, Mason said carefully. The police and the relevant federal agencies are going to do the official work. I'm going to make sure my family is protected while that work happens. It was a diplomatic framing and they both knew it. And Salas let it stand because he was practical enough to understand that a former Navy SEAL with direct knowledge of the target was an asset rather than a problem if pointed in a useful direction. Keep me informed, Salas said. Within reason, Mason said. Cross moved faster than Mason had anticipated. The second approach came not through a physical operation, but through a phone call, and it came to Madeline's direct line at Blackstone headquarters at 3:17 in the afternoon, 3 days after the gala. She was in her office when it came through. The number was unrecognized, routed through several intermediaries, and her assistant had almost screened it until the caller had said a specific phrase, tell her it's about her husband's past, that the assistant had correctly assessed as something Madeline needed to decide about personally. Madeline took the call. She put it on the secure line and recorded it from the first second and sent an immediate text to Mason that was just the letter X, which was their signal for something is happening. Stand by. The voice on the phone was smooth and unhurried and slightly accented. Eastern European, she thought, or something that had been trained away from Eastern European and hadn't entirely succeeded. Ms. Carter, the voice said, or perhaps Mrs. Reed would be more accurate. She said nothing. She'd learned from years of negotiation that silence was an instrument. You're recording this, the voice said. That's fine. I'd like there to be a record. A pause. My name is Damian Cross. I don't expect that means anything to you, but I'd suggest you ask your husband about it when you see him next. His answer will explain why I'm calling. What do you want? She said. Flat, direct. A conversation, in person, between myself and Mason Reed. Another pause, and something shifted in the voice. Not threatening, exactly, but intentional in a way that made the hair on her arms rise. He is, I understand, a janitor. I've always found that detail amusing. The man who destroyed 14 years of my work, sweeping floors. A short silence. I want to speak with him. If he refuses, or if law enforcement attempts to use this call to locate me before I'm ready to be located, I want you to know that I have resources in place that would make your life considerably more complicated. Not violent. I'm not interested in violence as a first option, but complicated. Complicated how? The board of directors of Blackstone Global will receive, by end of business tomorrow, documentation of your marriage. Your husband's full classified service record, which I have obtained through channels that will embarrass several agencies, and photographs of the two of you together that have been taken over the past 14 months, which will make it quite clear that the CEO of a major corporation has been hiding a personal relationship with a member of her own janitorial staff. He let that sit for a moment. The optics, as I understand the term is used in corporate circles, would be challenging. Madeline was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. Let me be clear about something, she said finally, and her voice was steady in a way that she was going to credit herself for later. You seem to believe that the existence of my marriage is a threat to me. I want you to think carefully about whether that's actually true. A brief pause. He hadn't expected that. If you'd like to speak with my husband, she continued, I'll ask him. I'm not going to promise his answer, but I'm also not going to be leveraged with information about my own life. She paused. And I want you to understand that this call has already been flagged to the relevant federal authorities. So whatever window you think you had to negotiate privately closed approximately 90 seconds ago. A longer silence this time. You're interesting, Cross said. I'm busy, she said, and ended the call. Her hands were shaking. She put them flat on the desk and breathed through it. 3 counts in, 4 out. The way she'd taught herself to manage adrenaline in high-stakes meetings when she couldn't afford to show what was happening underneath the surface. The shaking slowed and stopped. She picked up her phone and called Mason. He answered on the first ring. Damian Cross just called me, she said. 3 seconds of silence. Are you safe? I'm in my office. I'm fine. She looked at her hands. He wants to meet with you. He threatened to expose the marriage to the board if you refuse. Another silence. Shorter. Madeline. His voice had the quality it got when he was very controlled. I need you to listen to me carefully. Cross-calling you directly means he's changed his approach. He's not trying to grab you anymore. That failed. He's trying to surface me, get me into an environment he controls. I know. So we're not going to... Mason. She stopped him. I told him I wasn't going to be leveraged with information about my own life. A pause. You said that. Yes. To Cross. He seemed to find it unexpected. A longer pause, and then something in Mason's silence that she couldn't quite identify. Not quite relief, not quite something else. You recorded the call, he said. From the first second. It's already with Salas, and I sent the flag to Garrett's number. Okay, he exhaled. Okay, I need to come to the building. I know, but Mason, she stopped. Before you come, before we do whatever comes next. She looked at the ring on her desk, where she'd set it down when she picked up the call. He's going to release the information anyway. Whether you agree to meet him or not, he's going to use it because now he knows I won't cooperate and he needs a different lever. Probably, Mason said, which means the board is going to find out. Yes. So I need you to let me handle that part, she said. Not you, not Garrett, not Salas. Me. On my terms, in my timing, before he gets to do it first. A pause. Madeline, I can do this. She picked the ring up off the desk. I should have done it a long time ago. I'm going to call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning, and I'm going to tell them myself. And I'm going to do it before Cross has the chance to turn it into ammunition. She heard him breathing on the other end of the line, steady and slow, the way he breathed when he was working through something. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. I know. She turned the ring in her fingers. Drive carefully. The hours between that call and the next morning moved the way time moves in a crisis. Some of it dense and slow, some of it gone before she registered it passing. Mason arrived at Blackstone and spent an hour with the corporate security team, going through the full personnel roster with a specificity that made 2 of the team members visibly uncomfortable, which he noted and flagged to Sally's separately. The contamination wasn't deep. Cross had gotten to the event staffing and 1 communications contractor, both of whom were identified and removed. The remaining security personnel were intact. Sophie was brought back from Helen's and installed in the Blackstone secured residence suite that Madeline kept for high-risk periods, under the cover story that her father's building was having plumbing work done. Sophie accepted this with the particular look she had that meant she didn't fully believe it, but was choosing to trust the adults around her for the time being. She looked at Madeline over dinner, the 3 of them in the sweet small kitchen, Mason cooking because he always cooked when he was stressed and needed something to do with his hands, and said, "Something actually bad happened, didn't it?" Mason and Madeline looked at each other briefly. "Something happened at the gala," Madeline said carefully. "We're dealing with it." "Were you hurt?" She looked at the butterfly strips on Madeline's cheek. "A little. I'm okay." Sophie looked at her father's side, where he'd been moving carefully for 2 days without mentioning it. "Dad?" "I'm fine, Soph." "You're lying," she said, without heat, just factual. "Both of you." "But okay." She picked up her fork. I'm not going to ask more than that tonight, but I want to know when you can tell me. You will, Mason said. Sophie ate her dinner and didn't ask again. But before she went to bed, she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Madeline specifically. He worries about you, she said. In case you didn't know. Madeline looked at her. I know. He's not good at saying it, Sophie said, but it's pretty much all he's been doing for 2 years. She went to bed. Madeline stood in the kitchen and felt the weight of that, the way you feel things that are true, and that you've known but haven't quite let yourself know. And she didn't say anything for a moment, and Mason, who had heard all of it, kept his back to her and kept washing the dishes. She's not wrong, he said finally. I know, Madeline said. She crossed the kitchen and stood beside him at the sink, not touching him, both of them looking at the dark window above it. The city was out there doing its city things. Somewhere in it, Damien Cross was in a location the police hadn't found yet, operating on a plan that was now partly disrupted but not finished. After tomorrow, Madeline said. After the board meeting, whatever happens. Yeah, Mason said. It wasn't a full sentence. It didn't need to be. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and Madeline was awake at 4:30. She didn't try to go back to sleep. She lay in the dark of the suite's bedroom with the ceiling above her and ran the meeting in her head the way she ran every high-stakes presentation, not scripting it word for word, because scripted things sounded scripted, but mapping the terrain, where the resistance would come from, what forms it would take, which board members would follow Fitch's lead, and which ones would wait to see which way the room moved before committing, what she needed them to leave the room understanding, and what she needed them to feel, and how those two things were not always the same and had to be managed separately. She'd been doing this for 3 years as CEO. Before that, she'd done it as COO, and before that as VP of Strategy, and before that as the youngest senior analyst Blackstone had ever hired, the one they'd all underestimated in specific and slightly different ways that she'd kept track of because she found patterns useful. She knew how to walk into a room where people wanted her to fail and make them need her anyway. What she'd never done was walk into that room and tell the truth about something personal. That was the part she couldn't fully map, because it depended on variables she couldn't control. Not the board members' logic, but their instincts. Not what they thought, but what they felt when she said the words. And feelings didn't follow the same architecture as strategic calculations. She got up at 5 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and didn't open anything on it. Mason came in at 5:30. He looked at her and looked at the closed laptop and poured himself coffee and sat down across from her without saying anything, which was the right move. Tell me what you know about Adrian's role, she said. Whatever you've been building since the stairwells. He set his cup down. You want this now. I want it before I walk into that room. Yes, he told her. What he'd caught in fragments over weeks of late-night cleaning shifts, the calls about timing, the references to she, the operational language that didn't belong in a COO's stairwell conversations. The waterfront parking facility that Patrick had mentioned, which matched a date on which Mason had noticed Vaughn leaving the building 90 minutes earlier than usual. The communications contractor who'd been identified as compromised, and who Mason had learned from Salis the previous evening, had a payment trail that ran through a shell company with connections to one of Cross's surviving lieutenants. That contractor was on Vaughn's vendor list, Mason said. Vaughn signed the contract. Madeline looked at him. Salis has this? Salis has the contractor connection. He doesn't have Vaughn's vendor list yet. I do, because I have access to the Blackstone supplier database through the facilities management system. He paused. I pulled it 2 days ago. I was going to tell you when I had more. She sat with that for a moment. You accessed a corporate database. I'm an employee. I have legitimate access to the portion I used. Mason. I know, he said. It's a line. It's a line I need to know about before I walk into a board meeting where someone might raise it. Nobody's going to raise it. The access log for facilities management doesn't get reviewed unless there's a facilities incident. He held her look. But you're right that I should have told you immediately. She didn't push it further because there wasn't time and because she understood why he hadn't. The same reason she'd spent 18 months not having certain conversations, which was that carrying things alone was a habit both of them had built over years, and habits didn't break cleanly. Send what you have to Sally's this morning, she said, before 9. Already drafted. She nodded and looked at her coffee. And Adrian, he doesn't know yet that we have this. No. He's going to be in that board meeting. I know. She thought about that, about the specific challenge of sitting across a table from a man who had helped engineer an attempt to abduct her, who was going to sit in that room performing concern and loyalty while she performed composure, and neither of them was going to show the other what they actually knew. It was a negotiation, and she'd had worse ones, and the difference was that in those she hadn't been operating on 4 hours of sleep with butterfly strips on her face. Okay, she said. She opened the laptop, started working. The board members arrived between 8:45 and 9, filtering into the main conference room on the 41st floor with the particular energy of people who'd been called to an emergency meeting and had been speculating since the invitation landed in their inboxes. 12 of them in total, including Fitch, who arrived 3 minutes early and positioned himself at the far end of the table in a way that was probably unconscious but functioned as a territorial claim. Adrian Vaughn came in at 8:58, which was 2 minutes before the meeting started and calculated enough to be notable. He looked rested, which was either genuine or practiced, and he took his COO seat and opened his portfolio and looked professionally attentive. Patrick sat against the wall with his tablet, not at the table. He was not a board member. He was there because Madeline had asked him to be, and because he was the person in the room she trusted most, and she needed at least one point of stillness she could orient toward if things went sideways. She walked in at 9 exactly. She'd chosen the clothes carefully, not armor exactly, but deliberate. The suit she wore when she needed the room to take her seriously, rather than the one she wore when she needed them to like her, because today wasn't about being liked. She stood at the head of the table and didn't sit. I asked for this meeting because there's something you need to hear from me directly, she said. No preamble, no thank you for coming. Not from a news report, not from a legal brief. Not from whoever gets to you first with their version of events. From me. This morning. The room was very quiet. Even Fitch, who had been arranging his position for an ambush, seemed to recalibrate slightly at the directness. 3 nights ago at the gala, an attempt was made to abduct me. You know the general facts from the security report. She paused. What you don't know is why. And the why requires me to tell you something about my personal life that I should have told you a long time ago. She put both hands flat on the table. I'm married. My husband's name is Mason Reed. We've been married for 18 months, and I kept it private for reasons that seemed sound at the time, and that I'm no longer going to defend because the cost of defending them has become higher than the cost of telling the truth. The silence in the room changed texture. She watched faces, Fitch gone still, 2 board members exchanging a look, a third writing something, a fourth whose expression was unreadable, and who she'd always found the most interesting for exactly that reason. The attempt at the gala was not a random criminal act, she continued. It was orchestrated by a man named Damian Cross, who has a classified history with my husband's former Navy SEAL service. Cross's network was dismantled by an operation my husband was central to, and Cross, who was incorrectly designated as killed in action, has been building resources for the past 14 months with the specific goal of using me as leverage against Mason. Your husband, Fitch said, is the janitor. She looked at him. My husband is a former Navy SEAL who has been working in this building in a facilities role for operational security reasons. His words, which I've come to understand better than I'd like over the past week. She kept her voice level. Yes, he's been cleaning the executive floors. And 3 nights ago, he tracked a threat through the service corridors of the Meridian Grand, put 3 trained operatives on the floor of a parking garage, and got me out. The room absorbed this. I want to be clear about what I'm not doing this morning, she said. I'm not asking for your understanding. I'm not apologizing for my marriage. I'm giving you the information you need to make decisions about the security situation, the company's position, and if that's what you decide, my role here. She looked around the table. What I am asking is that you let me finish before anyone starts building a case. Fitch opened his mouth. Gerald! Her voice didn't rise. I said finish. He closed his mouth. And she thought she saw, very briefly, something on Patrick's face against the wall that wasn't quite a smile, but was close. She talked for 22 minutes. The security situation, the Cross investigation, what Salas had, and what the federal agencies were now involved in. The steps taken to protect company personnel and assets. The internal contamination, she used that word deliberately, watching the room react to it, that had been identified and excised from the security team and vendor roster. The status of the ongoing investigation, which she could speak to broadly without compromising law enforcement's work. She did not mention Adrian Vaughn by name. She watched him while she talked about the vendor contamination, and his face did nothing she could read, which was the same as it always did, which was why she'd watched him for months without being able to act. He was composed in the way that people are composed when they've prepared for a version of this conversation. When she finished, the questions started. Some of them were practical: security protocols, insurance implications, the company's public communications strategy. Some of them were harder. Fitch asked, in the particular way he framed questions that were accusations, whether the CEO's decision to maintain a secret marriage constituted a material omission to the board. "It's a personal relationship," she said, "not a business arrangement. The legal standard for disclosure doesn't apply. There's a facility employee. My husband is not a vendor or a contractor in a relationship with the company. He applied for and received an entry-level facilities position through the standard hiring process." She met Fitch's eyes. "There is no policy he violated. There is no policy I violated. There is a decision I made about my private life that I chose not to share, and I've already told you why I'm sharing it now. The optics, Gerald." This from the board member with the unreadable face, a woman named Constance Abril, who had been on the board for 9 years and who Madeline had never been able to fully read. "Let her finish answering one question before you start the next one." Fitch looked at Constance. Something passed between them that had history in it. The particular friction of two people who had been in rooms together a long time and didn't fully like each other. Constance turned to Madeline. "The man who ran this operation, Cross, is he in custody?" "Not yet. The investigation is active. I'm told there's been significant progress in the past 48 hours. "And your husband, where is he now?" "He's working with law enforcement." She paused. "He's also here in the building, which is where he'll be until this is resolved." Constance nodded once and made a note and didn't ask anything else. The meeting ran another 30 minutes. By the end of it, the room had divided, as it usually did, into the people who'd made up their minds in the first 5 minutes and the people who were waiting to see where the weight settled. Fitch was in the first category and wasn't satisfied, but he was also, Madeline noted, quieter than he'd been at the start, which meant something had shifted in his calculation. When it ended and people were gathering their things, Constance Abril walked past Madeline toward the door and said, quietly and without stopping, "Next time, don't wait 18 months. That was all. She kept walking. Mason got the call from Sally's at 11:47. He was in the security operations room on the 38th floor, going through surveillance logs with a member of the rebuilt security team when his phone went off. He stepped into the hallway. "We have a location," Salas said. "Warehouse District, South End. Thermal imaging puts 7 people inside, which is more than I'd like to go in against without knowing the layout." "I know the Warehouse District, South End," Mason said. "Which building?" "The Callaway Cold Storage Facility. It's been decommissioned." "I know it." He did. He'd run the district in his mental map 3 days ago when he was trying to think like Cross and identify where in the city you'd establish a secondary position if your first operation had failed. Cold storage facilities were good, thick walls, limited sight lines from the street, loading dock infrastructure that made moving people and equipment easy. "What's the approach plan?" "That's why I'm calling you." Salas paused. "I have SWAT and I have federal support, but Cross knows we're looking for him, and if he has any early warning system in place, he's going to move before we can position. We need someone who can get close without triggering whatever perimeter he has set. What you need is someone who knows his operational patterns and who won't make noise." Mason looked at the wall of the corridor, which had a fire safety notice on it that he'd read probably 400 times in the past year of working this building. He thought about Sophie in the secured suite 2 floors up. He thought about Madeline in the boardroom, probably right now, standing at the head of a table and telling the truth about him. "I need 30 minutes to look at the building layout," he said. You have 20, Salas said. But he told Madeline before he left. That was new. The telling before, rather than the managing information in stages that had characterized the past weeks. She was in her office when he knocked, her assistant giving him the particular look that assistants give people who arrive without appointments. And he said, I need 2 minutes. And she looked at his face and said to her assistant, Give us a few minutes. And the assistant left. He told her about the warehouse, the location, the approach, what Salas was planning and what his role in it was. She listened with her hands folded on the desk and her expression doing the thing it did when she was processing something she didn't want to process. Very controlled, slightly too still. You're going in, she said. I'm supporting the approach. Salas has the operation. I'm providing. Mason. She looked at him. I've been married to you for 18 months. I know what supporting the approach means. He was quiet for a moment. I know the building. I know Cross's patterns. If I'm not there and something goes wrong on the perimeter, people could get killed who don't need to be. And if you go and something goes wrong, then something goes wrong. He said it simply, not to be hard about it, but because softening it would have been its own kind of dishonesty. That's the calculation. She looked at him for a long time. Come back, she said finally. 2 words, flat and direct, and he understood they weren't a request. That's the plan, he said. She nodded once and looked back at her desk. He turned to go and she said, Mason? He stopped. Cross said on the call that he found the janitor detail amusing, that you'd been reduced to cleaning floors. She paused. I want you to know that I never thought of it that way. Not once. He looked at her. She was looking at the desk still, not at him. I know, he said. He left. The Callaway building was a long rectangular structure with 2 loading docks on the south face and a single pedestrian entrance on the east side that had been padlocked since the decommissioning 2 years ago. The padlock was new. Mason clocked that from 200 meters out, crouching in the shadow of a container yard that abutted the warehouse district's perimeter fence. He had an earpiece linked to Salas's command channel and a sidearm that Salas had cleared through proper channels after a conversation that Mason suspected had been slightly irregular on the paperwork side. He was wearing dark clothes that weren't a uniform and weren't tactical gear because the goal was to move through the perimeter quietly and not to look like what he was. Salas's voice came through the earpiece. SWAT is in position on the north approach, federal units on the west. We go on your mark when you've confirmed the east side. Copy, Mason said quietly. He moved. The cold storage facility had a specific internal logic he'd worked out from the building schematic. Thick, insulated walls designed for temperature control, which also meant sound didn't carry well between sections. There was a secondary service entrance on the east side that wasn't on the decommissioning survey map, which meant it was a later addition, which meant it was probably the entrance Cross's people were using, and probably not covered from inside the same way the main doors were. He was right about that. He was almost wrong about what was behind it. The service door was alarmed with a contact sensor. Simple, the kind you could buy from a commercial supplier, the kind that Cross would use because sophisticated equipment left traces. And Cross was good about traces. Mason had a magnetic bypass that worked on contact sensors and that Salas had sourced from the federal support team, and the bypass worked, and the door opened silently. What was behind it was a hallway that smelled of cold concrete and old refrigerant, and underneath those, something that made Mason's body go several degrees more alert before his conscious mind caught up. People had been here recently, not just Cross's operational team, someone who hadn't been here willingly. He moved through the hallway with the particular quality of movement that wasn't quite stealth, but was close. Deliberate placement of each step, weight distributed, nothing rushed. The hallway opened into what had been the main refrigerated storage area, now empty of everything except portable lighting that Cross's team had rigged and several folding tables with equipment on them. 3 men. Mason counted them in 2 seconds, 2 near the tables, 1 near the far wall. Armed, but not at ready. They were waiting, not responding to a breach. He keyed the earpiece once, the signal for I'm inside, 3 tangible contacts, and moved to the next doorway. Cross was in the secondary room. Mason knew it before he saw him, the same way you sometimes know things in a building you've studied. a quality of presence, something in how the other men were oriented. There was a fourth man in the doorway between rooms, and beyond him, Madeline. Not Madeline. He corrected himself. Madeline was at Blackstone, but the woman seated in the secondary room. He looked again. It was a corporate liaison named Diane Marsh, who handled Blackstone's government relations portfolio and who Mason had seen on the executive floor 3 times in the past month. She was zip-tied to a folding chair and she was scared, but she was upright and breathing and not visibly injured, and her presence here recontextualized things quickly. Cross hadn't given up on leverage. He'd shifted targets, and that meant the call to Madeline had been partly a distraction, drawing attention to the threat against Madeline while the actual operation moved against someone else with access to Blackstone's government contract portfolio. Mason keyed the earpiece twice, multiple contacts, secondary room, civilian hostage, and held position. Salas's voice came back. On your position in 90 seconds. Cross was standing with his back partially turned, speaking to someone on a phone. Mason got a clear look at him for the first time. He was taller than Mason had expected from the file photographs, late 50s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had become something more durable. There was a scar along the left jawline that was new, or at least not in the file, which was consistent with someone who'd survived a structural collapse that should have killed him. He was speaking in a low voice. Not English. Mason caught fragments, a language he had operational-level familiarity with, enough to understand the shape of what was being said without the full meaning. Something about confirmation, about timing, about the board meeting this morning, about Vaughn. Mason went very still. Cross wasn't just using Vaughn as an inside contact. He was finalizing something with him. The phone call, the timing. This wasn't Cross waiting to see how the Madeline operation resolved. This was a second track running simultaneously, and Vaughn was the mechanism. And whatever Vaughn had been arranged to do was happening now or close to now. He keyed the earpiece 3 times. Change in situation, possible secondary operation, need immediate communication with command, and moved back toward the hallway door. Salas was in his ear 10 seconds later. What's happening? Cross is on a call with an inside contact at Blackstone. The hostage here is Diane Marsh, government relations. I think she's leverage for the contract portfolio, not for me. He kept his voice below audible. The gala and the call to Madeline, those were to keep us looking at the wrong thing. The real operation is something Vaughn is executing right now, inside the building. A beat of silence. Our intel on Vaughn, whatever you have, it's not enough. Get someone to the 41st floor now. Vaughn's office or the server room, those are the 2 most likely locations for whatever he's doing. We're 90 seconds out. Go early, Mason said. I'll manage the situation here. Another pause, shorter this time. Salas making the call that field commanders make when the plan has to change faster than the process allows. Going early, he said. Do not engage before we breach. Understood, Mason said. He went back to his position and waited the 40 seconds it took for the north and west doors to blow simultaneously, and in the moment that Cross's 3 men in the main room turned toward the sound, Mason came through the connecting doorway, and the man guarding it was not prepared for something coming from inside rather than outside. The next 4 minutes were not clean. He told Sophie once, years ago when she'd asked about his Navy years, that the movies had it wrong. It wasn't sharp and choreographed. It was loud and confusing, and the best you could do was think faster than the situation and accept that you were going to take damage along the way. He took damage along the way. His ribs, which had been damaged at the gala and which had been complaining about that for 3 days, made their position on this additional activity very clear. He didn't stop, because stopping wasn't an option, but he was moving at about 80% efficiency by the time the SWAT team came through the north door, and the room became a very different kind of situation. Cross ran. Of course he ran. He was a man who'd survived things that should have killed him by making that same calculation every time. That survival was the priority, and everything else was secondary. He went for the service entrance that Mason had come through, the one on the east side, and he was fast for a man his age, and he got through the door before Mason could close the distance. He made it 30 feet into the container yard. Salas had put 2 people on the east perimeter. Mason had told him about the service entrance, and Salas had put people there. Cross stopped when he saw them, and the calculation that had served him across decades of operational experience ran its process and came out somewhere different this time. He put his hands up. Not from fear, Mason thought, watching from the doorway. From the particular practicality of a man who understood odds. Mason stood in the doorway with his ribs conducting their ongoing protest and watched Damian Cross put his hands behind his head and get taken down by 2 federal agents in body armor, and he thought about the after-action report 6 years ago that had listed this man as killed in action. He'd objected to that designation at the time. He was glad he hadn't been wrong enough to stop objecting. The call to Madeline came from Patrick first, which was wrong in the specific way that information arriving through the wrong channel is always wrong. It meant something had happened at Blackstone before law enforcement could contain it. She answered, and Patrick said, in a voice that was controlled with visible effort, "Adrian's in the server room. He's had access for about 12 minutes, and IT locked him out when they saw the access pattern, but we don't know what he got to before that." She was up and out of her chair before he finished. "Who else knows?" "Me, IT security, and now you. I haven't called building security because I don't know who I can trust in that team." "Call Salas directly. His number is in the contact I sent you last night." She was already in the hallway. "Don't call anyone at Blackstone. Where is Adrian now?" "Still in the server room as far as I know. I think he doesn't know we know." She went down the stairs instead of the elevator, faster, and the elevator felt enclosed in a way she didn't want right now. The server room was on the 36th floor, secured access, which meant Adrian had either used his legitimate COO credentials or had credentials that shouldn't exist. She came through the stairwell door on 36 and walked down the corridor and opened the server room door, and Adrian Vaughn was standing at a terminal with a USB drive in his hand, and he looked at her with an expression that rearranged itself in the half-second after he saw who it was. Surprise, then something that was calculating, then something that landed on a version of resigned professionalism that didn't fit the situation at all. "Madeline," he said. "Adrian." She looked at the terminal, at the USB drive. "What are you doing?" He looked at the drive for a moment. Then he set it on the terminal keyboard. "It's more complicated than it looks." "It looks like corporate espionage," she said. "Tell me the complicated part." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has run 3 different versions of this conversation in his head and doesn't like any of them. "Cross approached me 14 months ago. He had information about a financial arrangement from before I joined Blackstone, something that predated you, predated the current board composition. Something that would have ended my career if it surfaced." He said it flatly, like a briefing. He wanted access, internal information, routing for the government contracts, personnel security files. I gave him what I had to give him to make him go away, and then he came back for more, and then more after that. She looked at him. He looked tired in a way that wasn't tonight's tiredness. "You could have come to me," she said. "With what? Evidence that I'd been compromised for 6 months before I came to you? I'd have been out before I finished the sentence." He looked at the USB drive on the keyboard. "I didn't plan the gala. I need you to know that. The contractor. I knew Cross had someone watching the event staffing. I didn't know he'd authorized an abduction. When I found out what had happened, Adrian." She stopped him. "Stop." He stopped. "I'm going to be straightforward with you about something," she said. "Damian Cross is in federal custody right now. Whatever he told you he would or wouldn't do with the information he had on you, that's over. He's done." She watched his face process this. "And you have approximately the next 10 minutes before law enforcement arrives on this floor to decide whether you walk out of this room as someone who cooperated or someone who didn't." He looked at the drive, at her, at the drive again. "The USB contains the full government contract routing for the past 3 fiscal years," he said. "Cross wanted it to bid a competing contractor into position on the renewal. The contractor is his. It's how he's been funding the rebuild of his network." He exhaled. "That's everything. That's what it was." She nodded once. "Leave the drive. Come with me." He left the drive and came with her, and in the elevator going up, he looked at the wall and she looked at the floor numbers, and neither of them said anything. And when the doors opened on the 40th floor, Salas's people were already there. Mason came back to the building at 4 in the afternoon. He came through the lobby, looking like someone who'd had a difficult 4 hours, which was accurate, and the lobby security staff, new people, verified people, logged him in without comment. He took the elevator to the 38th floor and checked in with the security operations room, and then took the elevator to the secured suite and sat down on the couch and did not immediately get up. Sophie came out of the bedroom where she'd been doing homework and looked at him. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you." She sat down next to him on the couch, not touching him, which was her way. She wasn't a physical kid in that automatic way some kids were. She came at affection deliberately and on her own timeline. She sat close enough that her shoulder was almost against his arm. "Is it over?" she said. He thought about Cross in custody, Vaughn in federal custody. Diane Marsh, shaken but unharmed, reunited with her family by early afternoon. Salis with a case that was going to take months to fully untangle, but that had its central figure. "The main part," he said, "but not all of it. There's always more of it. But the part that was coming at us, yeah, that part's done." She was quiet for a moment. "Were you scared?" He thought about what she'd said to Madeline that first night they'd met. He gets scared too. He just doesn't let it show until after. "Yeah," he said. "I was." She leaned her head against his arm. "Okay," she said. Just that. They sat there for a while, the two of them on the couch in the secured suite with the city outside the window doing its late afternoon things, and Mason felt the particular exhaustion that comes after sustained tension releases. Not dramatic, just heavy, like gravity had increased slightly while he wasn't paying attention. Madeline came in at 5:30. She stopped in the doorway and looked at them on the couch. Sophie lifted her head. "He looks terrible," she said to Madeline. "He does," Madeline agreed. "I'm sitting right here," Mason said. Madeline crossed the room and sat on his other side, and for a moment none of them said anything, and the quality of the quiet was different from what it had been in this suite over the past few days. Not the quiet of people bracing for the next thing, but something closer to the actual texture of rest. "The board," Mason said. "Still processing," Madeline said. "Constance Abril called me after you left. She said the votes to remove me aren't there. And they weren't before the meeting either. Fitch was 3 members short and knew it. The whole thing was a demonstration of leverage, not an actual play." She paused. "Apparently she's known that for a week and didn't tell me, which I have feelings about." "Complicated feelings," Mason said. "Very." She leaned back against the couch. "Adrian is cooperating fully. His lawyer spent 2 hours with federal prosecutors this afternoon. The contract fraud is serious, but the cooperation is going to matter." She closed her eyes briefly. "It's going to take months." "I know." "And Cross, there's going to be a federal case that surfaces the operation that should never have been closed. Your name is going to be in it." "I know that too. Are you okay with that?" He considered the question with the honesty it deserved. Being okay with something and being ready for it weren't the same thing, and the public exposure of classified work was something that had consequences he couldn't fully map yet. For him, for people he'd served with, for the record of what had happened in a warehouse 6 years ago that the after-action report had gotten wrong. He wasn't entirely okay with it. He was going to deal with it. "I'll manage," he said. Sophie had fallen asleep against his arm. She did this occasionally, dropping off in the middle of things with the efficiency of someone who'd decided the immediate situation was handled, and rest was the logical next step. "She does that so fast," Madeline said quietly. "Always has." He looked at his daughter's face, which in sleep lost the serious expression it carried during the day, and became just a kid. She used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from school, 30-second commute, out cold. Madeline looked at Sophie for a moment, then at Mason. Her hand was on the couch between them, and she moved it and covered his. "I want to stop doing this the way we've been doing it," she said quietly. "The parallel tracks, the managing information in stages." She was looking at their hands. "I don't mean the security arrangements or the classified stuff. I mean the habit, the instinct to carry things separately." "Me too," he said. "It's not going to be easy to change." "No," he agreed, "but I'd like to try." He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat on the couch with Sophie asleep between them and the city outside the window and the particular weight of a day that had been what it had been. And neither of them said anything else for a while, because some things land better in silence than they do in words, and both of them were tired enough to accept that. The federal case against Damian Cross took 4 months to build and 3 days to crack open in court. Mason didn't testify in the first phase. His role was in the classified portion of the proceedings, handled in a sealed session with federal prosecutors and a judge who had the appropriate clearances. And what happened in that room stayed in that room except for the parts that fed into the public record in sanitized form. He'd been through enough of these processes in his military career to know how they worked. The slow grinding of institutional machinery, the way things that felt urgent in the field became bureaucratic in retrospect, the particular fatigue of watching something you lived through become a document. He sat in a waiting room outside the sealed session for 2 hours before they called him, and he read a sports magazine that he wasn't actually reading and thought about what he was going to say, which he already knew and didn't need to rehearse but thought about anyway because it was better than thinking about the alternative. Salis came out of the session at one point to get coffee and stopped by Mason's chair. "You doing okay?" Salis said. "Fine." Salis looked at him with the expression he'd developed over 4 months of working the case, which was the expression of a man who'd revised his understanding of something several times and had settled somewhere complicated. "For what it's worth," he said, "the KIA designation, the people who pushed that through made a judgment call with incomplete information. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth." "I know what it is," Mason said. "You filed an objection at the time." "I did." Salis was quiet for a moment. "If that objection had been acted on, the past 14 months don't happen." Mason looked at the magazine in his hands. "A lot of things don't happen if a lot of other things had been different." He set the magazine down. "I try not to build too much on that math. It doesn't go anywhere useful." Salis nodded slowly. "I'll go back in," he said. "They'll call you in about 20 minutes. He went back. Mason sat with the quiet of the waiting room and thought about Sophie's math homework that he'd helped with last night, which had been 4th grade fractions, and which had taken 45 minutes because she'd been tired and resistant, and he'd been patient with the problem and less patient with the resistance. And they'd ended up in a minor standoff over whether understanding the concept was actually necessary or whether getting the answer was sufficient. And she'd gotten the answer wrong twice before agreeing to understand the concept. And by the end of it, they were both annoyed and she'd gotten a hug in before bed anyway. That was the life. That was what he was here testifying to protect. He went in when they called him, and he told the truth, and he did it clearly and without embellishment. And when he came out 2 hours later, Madeline was in the waiting room. He stopped. She looked up from her phone. "I cleared my afternoon," she said. "You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to." She stood up. "I wanted to." He looked at her standing there in the waiting room of a federal courthouse in a coat that cost more than his first 3 months of janitor's pay combined, and he thought, not for the first time, but with the particular clarity that came from having almost lost her in a parking garage and a series of consequential conversations, that she was someone he was still figuring out after 2 years, which was not a problem, but a fact, and that facts of that kind were what you built a life on. "How was it?" she said. "Fine." He picked up his jacket from the chair. "It's done." She fell into step beside him toward the elevator, and he held the door, and they rode down together in the particular easy silence of two people who had learned to be in each other's company without filling every space. "The board met this morning," she said as they crossed the lobby. "I know, you texted." "I texted that there was a meeting. I didn't tell you what happened." He pushed the exterior door open and they came out into the cold afternoon, the kind of late November cold that came with low white sky and wind off the river. "Constance Abril proposed a formal resolution," Madeline said, "reaffirming my position as CEO, which is a thing that happens when there's been a challenge to leadership and it's been resolved. Standard procedure." She paused. "It passed 11-1. Fitch. Obviously." She pulled her coat tighter. "He's going to be difficult for the foreseeable future. But he's 3 out of allies on the board, and he knows it, and difficult without allies is a manageable problem." Mason looked at the street. A cab went by. A man walked a dog that was extremely fluffy and appeared entirely unbothered by the cold. "And the other thing," he said, "the resolution about the company's crisis preparedness structure." She was quiet for a moment. "That also passed." "Same vote?" 12-0. She glanced at him sideways. Fitch abstained rather than vote no, which is its own kind of statement about where he thinks this is going. The resolution had been Constance Abrill's idea, and Constance had called Mason directly to discuss it, which had been one of the stranger phone conversations of his life. A 70-year-old board member with a voice like a retired diplomat explaining calmly that she wanted to propose a formal advisory role for him in Blackstone's crisis preparedness and employee safety structure. Not an executive position, not a security chief title. An advisory role, structured to draw on his specific expertise with a scope that he'd been invited to help define. He'd listened to the whole proposal and then said, "Why?" Constance had been quiet for a moment, and then she'd said, "Because the man who spent a year cleaning executive floors and protecting this company from a threat nobody else even knew existed deserves something more than a facilities contract. And because my job is to think about what this company needs, and what it needs is people who actually do things rather than people who are good at talking about things." A pause. "Also because Madeline didn't ask me to do this, and I think it's funnier that way." He'd accepted. He told Madeline that evening, and her face had done the thing it did when she was trying not to smile and wasn't fully succeeding, and she'd said, "She didn't tell me she was going to do that." And he'd said, "I know, she mentioned that." And Madeline had said, "Of course she did." Walking out of the federal courthouse in the November cold, he thought about what Constance's proposal had meant underneath the practical terms of it. Not the role, not the title, not the formal acknowledgement, but what it said about how invisible labor eventually surfaces. How you can spend years doing work that no one sees and have it matter anyway, in ways you can't track and don't get to verify. He'd cleaned those floors and watched those stairwells and carried photographs in his jacket pocket and done the things that needed doing without a title or a budget or anyone's permission. And it had been enough because it had been necessary. And that was a principle he'd learned in the Navy and that the years since had tested in ways the Navy hadn't prepared him for. What he hadn't learned, what the parking garage and the board meeting and the federal courthouse had together taught him, in the slow way that real lessons come rather than the fast way movies suggest, was that invisible labor eventually costs something. Not always in dramatic ways, sometimes in the accumulation of small things. A daughter who learns to read fear on her father's face because he won't name it. A wife who carries secrets alone because her husband has made peace with being unseen. A marriage that exists on paper and in private, but doesn't occupy the space it's supposed to occupy in two people's lives. The cost wasn't dramatic. It was just erosion. And erosion, if you didn't address it, eventually changed the shape of things. He'd been thinking about that a lot in the 4 months since the warehouse. Sophie's parent-teacher conference was on a Thursday in early December, which was a week before the formal resolution vote and 2 days after the sealed federal session, and it was the first one Mason had attended where he wasn't the only parent in the room. The teacher's name was Ms. Ellery, and she was 32 and had the specific quality of good elementary school teachers everywhere, which was an absolute refusal to be intimidated by adults, combined with an equally absolute commitment to being honest about children. She had Sophie's work sample spread on the table when they came in. "She's doing well," Miss Ellery said, and then immediately added, "mostly," in the way that teachers add mostly when they want to make sure you're listening before they get to the real part. "Mostly," Mason said, "she's exceptionally good at reading situations, social dynamics, emotional undercurrents in group work. She's operating at a level significantly above her grade in that area." Miss Ellery folded her hands. "What she struggles with is accepting that she doesn't have to be right to be included. She tends to withdraw from group projects when she disagrees with the direction rather than advocating for her position." Mason and Madeline looked at each other briefly. "She gets that from me," Mason said. "She gets the withdrawal from somewhere," Miss Ellery said evenly, which was a teacher's way of declining to assign blame. "What I'd encourage at home is modeling disagreement, then engagement. Showing her that you can think something is wrong and still stay in the room and work on it." Madeline said, "We're working on that ourselves," and Ms. Ellery looked at her, and something passed between them that was the particular understanding of two adults recognizing a real thing being said. On the way out of the school, Sophie was waiting on a bench with her backpack on her lap, which was her posture when she was trying to look like she wasn't waiting. "How bad?" she said. "Not bad," Mason said, You're good at reading people and bad at staying when you disagree with them. Sophie considered this. That's accurate, she said after a moment. Ms. Ellery suggested we model better behavior for you, Madeline said. Are you going to? We're going to try, Madeline said. Sophie looked at them both with the particular assessment she'd been running on the adults in her life since she was old enough to run it. Whatever conclusion she reached, she didn't announce it. She got up and fell into step between them on the sidewalk, and her hand found Mason's in the automatic way it had since she was small, and after a moment her other hand found Madeline's. And they walked to the car like that in the December cold with the early dark coming in and the streetlights starting up one by one. Mason looked at his daughter's face, which was lit from the side by a passing car's headlights, and which wore the expression of someone who had decided, at least for right now, to not be suspicious of happiness. He understood that. He felt it too. The story broke in the press on a Friday, which was not ideal timing and also not entirely unexpected. The federal case had generated enough public record that the connection between Mason Reed, the Blackstone Facilities employee who'd been named in the initial police report, and the classified Navy SEAL operation that had originally taken down Cross's network was something that two investigative journalists at different outlets had been building toward independently. They published within 6 hours of each other, which created the particular media momentum of two sources confirming the same story. The coverage was not what Madeline had expected. She'd braced for a narrative that focused on the embarrassment angle, the CEO and her secret janitor husband, the corporate governance questions, the thing that Fitch had been trying to make it into. Some outlets went there. Most of them went somewhere else, because the Mason Reed story, when you had the full shape of it, was not a governance story. It was a human story, and human stories are harder to dismiss. Former Navy SEAL leaves military service after classified operations, raises daughter alone after wife's death, falls in love with and quietly marries the CEO of the company, where he later takes a maintenance job to stay close and protect his family from threats connected to his past. Spends a year cleaning floors in the building he'd later helped defend, overlooked by the executives who walked past him every night. Patrick had called her after the first article published and said, "The comment section is not what I expected." And she'd asked what he meant, and he'd said, "People seem to be rooting for him." And she'd said, "I know." And he'd said, "I mean really rooting for him. Like the ratio is unusual." And she'd said, "Patrick, I know." She'd sat with that for a while, in her office, alone, with the December light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. She'd thought about what it meant that people who'd never met her husband, who'd read 600 words about him in a news article, understood something about him that her own board of directors had had to be convinced of in a formal meeting. It wasn't that people were simple or sentimental. It was that the shape of what Mason had done was legible in a way that complicated things often weren't. He'd done the hard thing, the unglamorous thing, the thing that didn't come with recognition, and he'd done it consistently over a long period of time for reasons that had nothing to do with being seen. People recognized that. They recognized it because most of them had done some version of it in their own lives, and nobody had put them in a news article either. And there was something in that recognition that was not about Mason specifically, but about a kind of value that doesn't show up on the metrics that usually determine what gets counted. She'd thought about that for a long time. Then she'd called Constance Abril. "The press coverage," Madeline said, when Constance picked up. "I've seen it," Constance said. "I want to make a public statement, not a corporate communications statement, something personal. From me." A brief pause. "About?" "About why I hid it, what I was afraid of, and what I think now about what fear costs you when you let it make your decisions." She paused. "I'm not going to be polished about it. I'm going to say what's actually true." Constance was quiet for a moment. "Are you asking for my approval?" "No. I'm informing you because you're someone whose judgment I've come to respect, and I don't want you to be surprised." "Madeline," Constance's voice had the dry warmth it occasionally revealed. "The only thing that surprises me at this point would be you going back to doing things the careful, managed, here is my prepared statement way." A pause. "Say what's true. That's always been enough." Outside. The statement was released on a Tuesday. Patrick had helped her with the structure, and then she'd sent him out of the room and rewritten it 3 times until it sounded like herself rather than a corporate communications document with personal details inserted. She said that she had kept her marriage private out of fear. Fear of how the board would use it. Fear of what the press would make of it. Fear that the people who were already looking for reasons to undermine her leadership would find in her personal life the ammunition they needed. She said that fear, in her experience, was never a policy. It was just a decision you made because the alternative felt too exposed, and it always cost you more than facing the exposure would have. She said that her husband had spent a year in her building doing work that nobody thought twice about, and that in that year he had tracked a threat that nobody else had seen, protected her from a kidnapping, and identified the internal betrayal that had made both possible. She said he had done all of this without asking for recognition, without positioning himself for credit, without once suggesting that his background entitled him to anything other than the work in front of him. She said, and this was the part that Patrick had read twice and then looked at her and asked, "Are you sure?" And she'd said yes, that she had asked him to be invisible, and he had agreed because he loved her and because he understood the institutional pressures she was describing, and that asking the person you love to be invisible so that you can be more comfortable in public spaces is a cost you don't fully understand until you see what it does over 18 months. She said that the greatest professional mistake she had made was not marrying Mason Reed. It was allowing fear of other people's opinions to become more important than her own. The response to the statement was, as Patrick described it in a text message, significant. He followed it up with a second text that said the board is mostly fine. Fitch called me personally to say he has no further concerns about optics, which is the closest he gets to conceding a point. Please note this date for historical purposes. Mason read the statement on his phone in the parking lot of Sophie's school, waiting for pickup, and he sat with it for a while after he finished. He wasn't going to tell her what it cost him to read it, and not because they weren't doing the thing now where they didn't tell each other things. They were. He wasn't going to tell her because some things you receive quietly and hold the same way. Not because they're too big to name, but because naming them would make them smaller. Sophie came out of school and got in the car and looked at his face. "Good thing or bad thing?" she said. "Good thing," he said. She put her seatbelt on. "Okay," she said, and they drove home. The formal event was in January, the company's annual employee recognition ceremony, which Blackstone held every year in the Meridian Grand, the same hotel, the same ballroom, 460 people this time, the December additions to staff pushing the count up. Mason had agreed to attend as himself, not as a facilities employee, not as a former Navy SEAL, or as the subject of 6 news articles and a profile in a business magazine that he'd read once and found slightly disorienting, but as Madeline's husband, which was the only category that felt accurate to him, and the one he'd been the longest. He wore a suit that he'd bought for the occasion with Sophie's extremely detailed input. She had opinions about lapels. He had not previously known that he had opinions about lapels, but it turned out, upon being presented with options, that he did. And they didn't agree with Sophie's, and they'd had a 20-minute conversation about this in a men's clothing store while the salesman stood at a careful distance and said nothing. He ended up with a suit that was neither his first choice nor Sophie's, but was something they'd arrived at together, which felt like the right outcome. Sophie wore a green dress that she'd selected herself because she'd learned from the yellow courthouse dress at age 9 that she had a fundamental right to select her own formal wear, and nobody in the Reed household was going to argue with that conclusion. They arrived together, the 3 of them, and the ballroom was already full and warm and buzzing with the particular energy of a large gathering that doesn't know yet what kind of evening it's going to be. Mason had been in this ballroom under 3 different sets of circumstances now. The gala, where everything broke open, the parking garage underneath it, where it broke further, and now this, and the quality of walking in through the main entrance rather than the service level was something he registered without making a thing of it. People looked at him. He was aware of that. Not in the hostile or prurient way he'd half expected, based on 6 news articles and a general understanding of how public attention works, but in the way people look at someone they've formed an opinion about from a distance and are now recalibrating from up close. He met enough eyes to know that the recalibration was mostly running in a direction he could live with, and then he stopped tracking it because tracking it was its own kind of trap. Sophie stayed close for the first part of the evening and then found two kids her own age whose parents worked in IT, which Mason counted as a successful social outcome, and drifted away with the efficiency of someone who had made her decision and was acting on it. Patrick found Mason near the bar and shook his hand with the genuine warmth of someone who had decided, at some point in the past 4 months, that they were going to actually like each other rather than being cordial around a shared third party. "How are you holding up?" Patrick said. "Fine." He looked around the room. "It's a lot of people." 462 as of the final RSVP count. Patrick accepted a glass from a passing tray. "For what it's worth, the room is on your side. I've been taking the temperature all evening." That's a strange thing to need to measure. Most things in this building are strange things to need to measure. Patrick looked at him with the directness of someone who had been managing communications for 15 years and had learned to be blunt as a time-saving measure. "She's been in this room for an hour doing the thing she does, which is making each person feel like the most important conversation she's had all night. She's good at it, but she keeps checking where you are." Mason looked across the room and found her almost immediately, which was a thing he'd always been able to do in crowded spaces. Locate Madeline the way you locate the fixed point your eye returns to. She was talking to 3 department heads, and she was indeed doing the thing Patrick described, fully present in the conversation. And she was also aware of exactly where he was, which he knew because she didn't look at him, but she adjusted her position slightly when he moved. "She's always been able to track a room," Mason said. "She tracks you specifically," Patrick said. "The room is secondary." He said it like he was clarifying a data point, not making an observation about feelings, and Mason appreciated the delivery. Madeline took the podium at 8:30, after dinner, which was the same strategic slot she'd used at the gala 4 months ago. The speech she'd written this time was different in a way that was hard to define precisely, but was visible in how the room received it. Less architecture, more honesty, the same intelligence applied to saying things directly rather than saying things well. She talked about the year, not the events of the gala and the warehouse, those were documented elsewhere, and the people in the room knew the outline, but the year as a study in what an institution actually is when you look past the org chart. She said that the org chart told you where authority lived, but what she'd learned was that authority and contribution weren't the same thing, and that the people who held the institution together under genuine pressure were often not the ones who showed up in the formal record. She said that she wanted to name one person specifically, and that she was doing it not to make a point or to perform a kind of public atonement. She used that phrase, public atonement, and the room knew what she meant by it, but because naming things accurately was a form of respect that this person had earned several times over and that she was late in delivering. She said, "My husband spent a year working in this building in a role that nobody here associated with anything except mops and supply carts. He did that because he was protecting his family, and because he understood a threat that the rest of us didn't know existed, and because he was willing to be overlooked for as long as it took for that protection to matter. It mattered. It mattered in ways that several people in this room are sitting here tonight because of." She paused. "I was afraid to say that publicly for a long time. Afraid of what it would mean for how this room saw me. Afraid that the story of who my husband is would become a story about my judgment, my choices, the things that made me look less than fully in control of my own narrative." She looked at her notes and then looked up and away from them. "Fear is an understandable thing. It is not, in my experience, a good advisor. And the cost of listening to it was 18 months of asking someone I love to be invisible so that I could feel more secure." The room was quiet in the particular way that 460 people go quiet when they recognize something true being said. "This is Mason Reed," she said. "He's the bravest person I know, and the best father I've ever watched at work, and he's going to be visibly and permanently part of this institution going forward. Not because I'm making a statement, because it's accurate, and accuracy is something I've decided to prioritize." He was standing toward the back of the room, and when she said his name, the nearest people turned to find him, and the turn rippled outward through the crowd the way these things do. And he stood there and received it with the stillness he'd always had in situations that required it. Not stiff, not performing composure, just actually still, the way he was when things mattered. Sophie found him from across the room and navigated through adult legs and elbows with the determination she brought to things she'd decided to do, and she appeared at his side and took his hand and looked up at him. "Are you okay?" she whispered. "Yeah," he said. "You look like you're about to cry." "I'm not," he said. Then, "Maybe a little." She squeezed his hand. "That's allowed," she said, with the authority of someone who'd decided it was. The applause started before Madeline finished, not because the room had decided to approve or reward or validate. Rooms do those things, and the sound is different, more self-satisfied, more about the room than the subject. This was something else. It was the sound of 460 people recognizing a thing they hadn't had language for until 30 seconds ago. A thing about the gap between what gets counted and what counts, and the occasional repair of that gap when someone is willing to pay the cost of repairing it. Mason didn't clap. His hands were occupied, one holding his daughter's, one held by his wife, who had made her way from the podium through the crowd to where he was standing, which had taken her approximately 90 seconds, and had involved navigating around 3 board members and a dessert cart. She reached him and didn't say anything. She held his hand and stood next to him, and they both looked at the room, which was still applauding, and he felt Sophie on one side and Madeline on the other, and the particular weight of a moment you know you're going to carry for a long time, not because it's over, but because it's solid. Real in a way that performance isn't. Things were not finished. They weren't going to be finished for a long time in the specific way that lives are never finished, they just accumulate. There was the federal case, which would run for months. There was Vaughn's cooperation agreement and the restructuring of Blackstone's security infrastructure and the external audit of the government contracts that Cross had been trying to manipulate. There was Fitch, who would find his footing eventually and be a problem again in the way that institutional conservatives find their footing and become problems, because institutions are not changed permanently by single events. They're changed slowly, and the work of that change is unglamorous and never quite done. There was Sophie, who was 10 years old and had been reading adults for years and had come to some conclusions that would need to be revisited as she grew, and who had a mother now in the fullest sense of the word and was still figuring out what to do with that, which was going to be its own kind of journey at its own pace. There was Mason, who had spent his adult life protecting people who wouldn't know his name, and who was going to spend the foreseeable future learning what it felt like to be known, not celebrated, not defined by the news articles, not reduced to the Navy SEAL backstory or the janitor detail or any of the shapes the story got flattened into when people needed it to fit a frame. Just known. By the woman holding his hand and the daughter holding his other hand, and the institution he'd been part of in ways they were still mapping. And there was Madeline, who was 31 years old and who had spent her entire career learning to perform certainty in rooms that would use any uncertainty against her, and who had just stood at a podium and said something true that scared her, and who was standing next to her husband feeling the particular aftermath of that. Not relief exactly, not pride exactly, something older and quieter than either of those. She had made him invisible, and she had thought she was protecting him. And what she understood now, understood in the specific way you understand things that cost you something to learn, was that invisibility, even chosen, even strategic, even loving in its intention, is a diminishment. The person you ask to be invisible doesn't just hide from the world. They hide from themselves, and the world loses the specific thing they were there to contribute. Mason had contributed anyway. That was the thing about him that she'd recognized in an alley in the rain and kept recognizing in slightly different forms for 2 years. He didn't need recognition to do the work, but the work mattered more when it was seen. Not for his sake. He was genuinely indifferent to the applause. She could feel that in the steadiness of him beside her. For the world's sake. Because the world makes worse decisions when it can't see what's actually holding things together. She thought about all the Masons she'd walked past in her career, the people in the unglamorous roles doing the essential work, invisible by institutional convention and personal habit, and the particular social arrangement that sorted people by title and compensated them accordingly and rarely asked what it actually took to keep things functioning. She'd walked past them, and she hadn't known their names, and she'd been running a company. She knew more of their names now. She'd made that a project over the past 4 months, quietly, without announcement, learning the names of the facilities team, the overnight security staff, the building maintenance crew, the contractors who came at 6 a.m. to do the things that needed to be done before the executives arrived. Not as a statement, as a correction. It didn't fix everything. It wasn't supposed to. It was just the work you did when you'd identified a thing you'd been getting wrong. The applause settled eventually, the way applause does, and the evening moved into its later phase. The informal part, the conversations, the particular human resolution of a formal event into the smaller and more honest exchanges that happened when the structure came down. Mason talked to the head of the facilities team, a woman named Barbara, who had worked at Blackstone for 11 years, and who looked at Mason with the expression of someone who had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. "You did good work up here," she said finally. "Maintenance-wise. I was sorry to lose you off the roster." He laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised him. "Thank you." "I mean it." She was completely serious. "People think the night shift is nothing. It's not nothing. You know what you know about a place when you've cleaned it?" "You do," he agreed. "You can always come back," she said, "if the advisory thing doesn't work out." He looked at her and she looked at him, and there was a kind of respect in it that had nothing to do with news articles or federal cases or ballroom speeches. And he received it the same way he'd received everything that mattered, which was quietly and without making it smaller by saying too much about it. Later, much later, when Sophie had fallen asleep in the car on the way home, 30 seconds as advertised, and the city was doing its late-night thing outside the windows, Madeline looked across the back seat at Sophie's sleeping face and then at Mason, who was driving. "She's going to be something," Madeline said. "She already is," Mason said. Madeline looked at his profile in the dark car, the scar on his left hand from the warehouse, the careful way he held the wheel, not gripping it, just holding it, the specific quality of his attention, which was never theatrical, but was always complete. "I spent a long time," she said, "being afraid that loving you was a liability." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said, "and now I think it's the only thing in my professional life that was never about politics or performance or managing perception." She looked at the road ahead. "Everything else I've built, there's a version where the calculation came first. This was the one thing where it didn't." He reached across and found her hand in the dark and held it. "Me too," he said. They drove home through the quiet streets with their daughter asleep between them and the city outside doing what cities do, indifferent and constant and full of lives being lived simultaneously, some of them difficult, some of them lucky, most of them some combination of both that didn't resolve into a lesson so much as into the ongoing fact of being human and doing your best with the material you had. The best that Mason Reed had brought to it, to an alley, to a courthouse, to a supply closet in a building he cleaned for a year, to a parking garage, to a federal waiting room, to a ballroom where his name was said out loud and meant something, was not extraordinary skill, though he had that. It was not tactical precision, though he had that too. It was the specific, stubborn, entirely ordinary willingness to stay, to show up for the unglamorous version of the thing, every day, without needing anyone to see you doing it, to protect what mattered and ask nothing in return except the chance to keep doing it. Most people never get their names said out loud in a ballroom. Most of them deserved it anyway. That was the truth Madeline had finally said in public, and it was the truth that would take years to fully act on, and it was the truth that was worth every cost she'd paid to get to it. The car turned onto their street. Sophie slept. Mason drove, and the quiet between them held everything that didn't need to be said.